The last few months have been a hectic one for the Dragon Age series, to say the least, and much of this turmoil has come down to the stupefying marketing campaign of BioWare.
We're going into the Fade, aren't we?
But the sheer scale of this fan reaction is also a reflection of the weight of its inheritance. You see, the plot of the Veilguard is a direct continuation of what I hope to convince you is the greatest RPG expansion ever created. And before the Veilguard thrusts itself forehead first into the gaming world, I want to celebrate this greatness. Because whether it will be viewed as a missed opportunity or an amazing setup for an epic tale, in retrospect, Tresspasser deserves more respect. But before I get carried away, I'm sure you're thinking, what do you mean by the greatest? By whose standards? Well, I suppose there is no way of objectively proving that Tresspasser or any DLC expansion is the greatest, but I also didn't pull this concept out of thin air. You see, the expansion format comes with certain expectations, and I believe that an expansion can be judged against its ability to meet these expectations. Well, what are they, you might ask? Well, to really answer this question, we need to go back to the beginning. There's a lot of debate over what constitutes the first expansion pack, but if one uses a modern definition, it has to be Xanadu Scenario 2. Scenario 2 was first conceived by Nihon Falcom in 1986 as an add-on to the successful release Xanadu. On a basic level, what made Scenario more than just a mini new release was that it couldn't be played without a copy of the original and was sold at a lower price. But what really made it, and by extension, this new expansion format different from a full release, was its unique mission statement. Scenario wasn't trying to be either a copy-paste continuation nor a smaller new title. No, Nihon used its more limited scope to experiment with new ideas and refine the original formula. Scenario 2 offered a slate of new content that experimented with the original formula, from the addition of new enemies and levels to completely different forms of storytelling. And while modern expansions might claim a far more ambitious scope than Scenario 2, nor require a physical copy, because actually owning stuff is so 1980. But the standard it established, namely that expansions should aspire to develop the formula of their base game, persists to this day. And so I believe an expansion's quality should be judged against their ability to achieve this improvement. So why is Tresspasser the greatest when there are so many excellent expansions to pick from the Hearts of Stone to Honest Hearts to the Throne of Baal? Well, it's because unlike any of these previous examples, Tresspasser goes beyond the Xanadu standard. It doesn't just build upon the Inquisition formula, it fundamentally transforms our perception of the base game, such that Inquisition before and after Tresspasser feel like completely different universes, leagues apart in quality and substance. And I've not seen any other game achieve such an effect since. You see, at launch, Inquisition was quite like a Kunari forehead, smooth but rough around the edges. It was well received by fans and critics alike as a return to form after the, in my opinion, underrated but in most people's underbaked Dragon Age 2. Inquisition revived the classic CRPG style tactical combat, gave players far more freedom with which to play and explore the world than the claustrophobic and linear adventures of Hawk, and overall was a pretty good experience. But it wasn't perfect, and as the euphoria that it wasn't Dragon Age 2 began to dispel, its flaws became increasingly apparent. You see, unlike the innovative Origins and cohesive 2, Inquisition felt like it didn't quite know what it wanted to be. Was it a return to the Origins formula with CRPG combat and role-playing as a main focus? Or was it an open world successor to Skyrim? And as usually happens, whether in life or game development, when you're not really sure what you want to be and try to do a lot of things at once, at times the quality wasn't there. Its open world was large like Skyrim's, yes, but it lacked the sheer attention to detail that made Bethesda's take so distinctive. And its story felt like Dragon Age, but it lacked the cohesion and completeness of the first two. And so to mask this lack of substance in both story and world design, Inquisition often had the unfortunate habit of bombarding us with sheer quantity of stuff regardless of its quality. From a game design perspective, this would lead to the infamous hinterlands problem, in reference to the overly bloated starting region. But the biggest victim, at least in my and many others' opinion, was the narrative itself. Inquisition was all set up and no execution at launch. A story centered around Corypheus had so much potential. As the architect of the Blight, there was perhaps no candidate better equipped to be used as a vehicle for delving into the most fundamental mystery of the lore in the entire series. But at the time, it seemed like Inquisition didn't want to recognize this. It barely even touched on the Blight, nor gives any real insight into Corypheus' motivations apart from the fact that he wants power, and he's from Tevinter, and he's evil, and he's blighted. We don't really know much else about it. And to make things worse, after his defeat, we're told that, plot twist, Corypheus didn't even matter in the first place. And in fact, Solus, who is actually a mysterious figure known as the Dreadwolf, started this whole mess in the first place by planting the orb on Corypheus. Now, ordinarily, this would have been a fascinating revelation that built an immense level of hype for the next entry if the epilogue had expanded on Solus's motivations and set him up as a new, fascinating threat. But it didn't, and so the prevailing sentiment among players after Inquisition, including myself, was, is that really it? That is, until Tresspasser. I remember when it was first announced, I felt like this was BioWare's opportunity to really close the circle and provide the answers I and many others were yearning for. And they did this, but in a way that subverted my expectations so expertly that it molded my entire view of Inquisition, and I will never forget this. The expansion starts off with a simple enough premise. 2 years after the defeat of Corypheus, a council of the Inquisition's most powerful sponsors has been assembled to decide its fate, and you, as its leader, have been summoned to take part in these talks. But before I go further into this plot, I just want to say, while Trespasser's greatness largely stems from the fascinating transformative narrative that unfolds from here on, and as a consequence, most of what I'm going to focus on relates to this narrative, I also want to highlight the creative decision making that enabled this plot to shine, namely the shift to a more linear format. Linearity, as we'll see, really plays to Inquisition's and BioWare's strengths in a way that the far more open original just didn't. As shown by Andromeda a few years later and the base game of Inquisition, BioWare are not particularly adept at handling open worlds. Their strength lies in the narrative and at times strategic combat department. And I just want to highlight this before I go deeper into the narrative. Trespasser begins in the vein of its initial premise with a meeting of the Exalted Council. But as we soon find out, this bureaucratic visage is naught but a thinly veiled facade. You see, soon after the council meets, the Divine in secret lets us know that a dead Kunari in full armor has been recently discovered in the palace, and no one knows how or why they have such a massive forehead. No, sorry, that's the Veilguard plotline, not in Trespasser. No, in Trespasser, no one knows how or why they were there. As the Inquisitor, it's our job to suss out what's going on beyond the forehead. Sorry, again, Veilguard's getting in my head. They're just so smooth. Anyway, we begin to investigate this further, and after a brief search, it becomes clear that the Divine was right to be concerned. A blood trail leads straight to a letter near an Alluvian, an ancient elven teleportation device that talks of a Kunari plot to invade southern Thedas using said devices. But things get even weirder from here. You see, after further investigation, we find out there's another player in this game, Fen'Harel, an ancient elven god, not seen since the fall of Alathan. This is surprising enough, but the source also shockingly reveals that this god has a friend, us, a theme that the leader of the Kunari conspiracy, Vidasala, also repeats when we confront her. When we report these mysterious findings to the council, and they mention that Fen'Harel goes by another name, the Dreadwolf, it becomes obvious that despite his disappearance 2 years earlier, Solus is Fen'Harel, and he's involved. A theory Vidasala confirms when we confront her again, and she reveals that this agent of Fen'Harel kept us alive, founded the Inquisition, and gave Corypheus the orb. This is interesting enough stuff and slightly fleshes out the plot, but I remember at this point in the narrative, I felt a bit overwhelmed by these initial revelations, but my slight disappointment only made what came next when we finally confront Solus all the more remarkable.
Your forces have failed. Leave now and tell the Kunari to trouble me no further.
Our confrontation starts off simply enough. Solus zaps a Kunari and reveals that he is indeed an elven god, which anyone half awake knew a few hours ago, and that he gave the orb to Corypheus and unintentionally caused this whole mess. But it's what he says next that really changes everything. You see, Solus tells us that the entire history of the elves is a lie. The gods were not gods, but tyrannical generals who desired above all else to expand their power and dominion over life. And when they took this lust for power too far by striking down Mythal, Solus rebelled against their tyranny. But despite his best efforts, he discovered soon enough enough that they were simply too powerful to be outright defeated. And this is where things get really interesting. You see, instead of fighting them, Solus came up with a plan to lock them away in the Fade by creating a barrier between the material and spiritual world that is commonly referred to as the Veil. But this act came at a great cost, one Solus did not anticipate. It didn't just cut off the gods from our world, but all elves from the source of their power and immortality, dooming all Thedas to civilizational decline that cannot be reversed as long as the Veil remains intact. Solus, as the chief architect, bears a tremendous level of guilt for this outcome and sees restoring the pre-Veil world as a duty that he himself is responsible for, despite the potentially catastrophic consequences of doing so. And this is how we get to the plot of Inquisition. You see, after awakening from a state of hibernation, thousands of years after the creation of the Veil, Solus found that he was simply too weak to activate the orb he needed to reverse this ceremony. So he gave it to Corypheus, hoping that in the process he would die, leaving himself to pick up the pieces. Ever since then, we've been inadvertently laying the groundworks for tearing down the Veil. As a servant of the Dreadwolf, we defeated Corypheus, leaving Solus to recover his power. We put a stop to the Qunari conspiracy, giving Solus complete control over the Illuvians, and now he is ready to complete the ritual, tear down the Veil, and potentially unleash a league of demons into the material world. At this point, you can respond, but in a kind of poetical representation of this whole story, you have no control. Solus is the protagonist, and whatever you do, he will amputate your arm, taking away the anchor, and bid farewell to achieve his mission. At this point, we have the decision to disband the Inquisition, knowing very well all of its actions up until this point were compromised, or to continue unabated. And this is where the Veil Guard starts. Not only does this ending set up a far more complex, interesting villain than Corypheus, so much so that he becomes almost a footnote despite being the main protagonist of Inquisition, but it completely recontextualizes the entire plot of the base game, from the most minute conversations to major plot points, adding layers of depth where there were none before. I remember when I first completed Tresspasser, it felt like I was experiencing a religious epiphany. Knowledge had been revealed to me that was formerly hidden off, and I could no longer see things as they were. Inquisition went from a game I enjoyed, but never really admired, to one that felt like it was intricately welded together by a master craftsman who knew exactly what they were doing, how we would react, and how to use this knowledge to set up a punchline that would leave us begging for a follow-up. And when I replayed the game with this new brain, moments that meant nothing or seemed like naught but interesting flavor text now acquired a level of meaning that I simply couldn't perceive without Trespass. A great small example of this are the frequent dialogues between Varric and Solus over dwarven society.
I see so much of this world in dreams. Humans, my own people, even Qunari. Dwarves alone were lost to me, save scattered fragments of memory where some spirit cared to watch. Now I know why I see so little.
And why is that?
Dwarves are the severed arm of a once mighty hero, lying in a pool of blood, undirected. Whatever skill at arms it had, gone forever. Although it might twitch to give the appearance of life, it will never dream.
I'd avoid mentioning that to any Carta, Chuckles. They might not take it the right way.
Now, without knowledge of Solus's plan, his tone version on disgust seems out of place in this whole discussion. Why is he so obsessed? Perhaps, as Varric sees it, it's a sign of his attachment to this world of dreams and memories that doesn't exist in tangible reality. After Tresspasser, however, multiple new dimensions emerge. His tone now seems like a reflection of his own hatred for the barrier that separates the elves from their true nature. A hatred so strong, he is willing to tear down the world to rebuild what was lost. And the fact that he has such an obsession with the topic almost reads like Solus subconsciously trying to convince himself of his own righteousness because he knows the sheer weight of what is going to come about when he tears down the veil. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Tresspasser adds such an insane level of depth to Inquisition that it transforms it entirely. And I'm far from alone in thinking this. Go on forums and you'll see before and after Tresspasser ratings for Inquisition. Such was its impact. And this is why I believe it is the greatest expansion in RPG history. Many titles are delivered on far more expansive or ambitious concepts that had a great deal of worthwhile additional content, but none that I can recall truly realize the potential of the original quite like Tresspasser. So whether Veilguard delivers on a plot as large and ambitious as its foreheads, or collapses faster than Diddy's legal defense, I believe it deserves to be remembered for what it was. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and if you're interested in more Dragon Age content, I've got another video lined up before Veilguard comes out, so stay tuned.